Welcome to installment number 4 of edTPA for English as an Additional Language. And in this installment, we're going to talk about how you're going to be evaluated on the planning task, task 1. So this is the continuation of the handbook, and you can follow along in your handbook where you will find the rubrics for the planning task. As a reminder, we go back again to the cycle of effective teaching and edTPA tasks. We are still on task 1, which is the planning task. And this time, we are focusing on how you will be evaluated on your success in planning. So let's take a look. Okay, planning. How will the evidence of my teaching practice be assessed? So when you're preparing your artifacts and commentaries, you're going to refer to the rubrics frequently to guide your thinking, your planning, and your writing. Don't wait until you're done to look at the rubrics. So take a look now at the rubrics as we go through this, and then make sure that you keep referring to them to be clear that you are including what you need to be including in order to get a high score. So for task 1, planning for instruction and assessment, you will be assessed with 5 rubrics. Let's look at each of the 5 rubrics now. Rubric 1, planning for English language development within content-based instruction. So this is sort of an overall view of the language and content together. Okay, so the highest score for that is for plans that build toward deep integration between language competencies and content learning. So if the evaluator can see that you have seamlessly integrated the content and language, so it's not separate, oh, let's study language, let's study content. Then it's important that multiple modalities are targeted and students are practicing more than one language modality. Now, modality here is what we've been calling in our program the 4 skills: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. They're referred to as modalities. So in other words, be careful that you're not overly focusing on listening and speaking and neglecting reading and writing, or vice versa. So now we go to rubric 2. This is planning to support varied student learning needs. And here's where you want to think about differentiating your instruction. So first, the supports are tied to learning objectives and the central focus. So whatever you're doing to support your learners should be with a view to helping them meet the objectives within the context of the central focus you've selected. Next bullet says that we need supports that will address individuals with similar needs. So, for example, your group of beginners, your group with struggling reading issues, you will differentiate for not just individuals, but groups with similar needs. So that's important also. The third point says that you need to take into account any specific categories that the students fall into, such as having an IEP and 504 plan, if they have low literacy or schooling prior to arrival, that's another factor. All right, next, you want to be sure that when you provide support, you've taken into account what the common problems are for students studying this particular type of language or content. So misunderstandings about the content or errors in language, that you're targeting them in advance, and not only in your feedback, but in your planning. And finally, a really strong response in the commentary on planning is going to use justification from principles that you have studied in your program on EAL education. So relevant research, relevant theory is supposed to be incorporated into your commentary. All right, rubric 3, Here we talk about using the knowledge of students to inform teaching and learning. Now remember, you've done the context for learning, so that was done for a reason. This is where your context for learning is really going to help you. So you will be justifying why the language tasks are appropriate based on what you learned about the students' language learning needs, the assets they bring in terms of their personal, cultural, or community assets, and their funds of knowledge, their background information, the content they already know, the skills they already have. What is it they're bringing and what is it they need? You need to look at both. And you have to have examples in your justification of how the tasks are meeting the demands of the content area for these students. Next, you have to, again, if you want a strong response, link this to research and theory in the field. And in addition, cite specific principles that you have used to aid you in providing the plans for this learning segment. Next, we go to the fourth rubric, and here this one is focused on language, and here they're going to be looking for identification of the vocabulary and additional language demands associated with the language function. And remember, the reason it says vocabulary and additional language demands is that most teachers focus solely on vocabulary, and that is not what's expected. With the edTPA, especially in ESOL, but in all fields of teaching, additional language demands are vital. That will include grammatical competence, pragmatic competence, discourse competence, and metalinguistic competence. And you need to be specific about what you are incorporating. In addition, the targeted support for the vocabulary and language demands has to be evident. So if you're using sentence frames, or if you're using a particular web link that provides additional information for them, you need to say what the supports are and how they're targeted, and that will make your plan stand out as strong on the support for language demands rubric. And then, of course, the different levels of language learning. So if you have beginners, intermediate, advanced, or transitional students, you need to be clear about which supports are provided for each. And if you refer to the WIDA standards, this will be very, very helpful for you. The WIDA standards provide the levels from emergent all the way to bridging, which correspond roughly to the levels for New York State. And you can use the WIDA standards in helping you to differentiate the supports that you provide. The visual supports, the graphic supports, the social affective supports. All of those types of supports will be important. And that does include support by L1, which is definitely acceptable in this context, especially for beginners. And finally, we come to Rubric 5. Rubric 5 has to do with your assessments. Now remember, we're still talking about the planning task. So this is an evaluation of how you plan your assessments. How will you be monitoring and supporting students' development of English language in your assessments? So first thing is multiple measures, and I'm sure you recall this from your assessment course. You must have multiple forms of evidence. You cannot only be assessing through one instrument. You have to get at it from various directions because some students may perform well in one type of display of mastery, but not in another. The second is that the assessments allow for specific needs students. So if there's a student who is low literacy, but they have to demonstrate content mastery to you on one of your content objectives, please include a type of assessment that does not require reading and writing to demonstrate the content knowledge. And here we come back to the balancing of the three schemata, which you might want to review to help you remember how important it is to balance the three schemata: language, content, and formal schema. And finally, if they have an IEP or 504 plan, you need to make sure that your assessments are following whatever their plan says they get in the way of modifications or accommodations. So this really should spell out for you what each of the 5 rubrics tells you. And I thank you very much for watching installment number 4, even though the slide seems to say number 2. Thank you.